Hi everyone, this is the last time you'll hear my voice. I'm kind of glad I don't have to listen to these because I think it's weird hearing my own voice. Um, but anyways, so this is part 3 and this will be the last part of the lesson. And this is radical equations. So this is chapter 1-6. Um, Another thing, since we don't have class today, make sure you spend some time this week. Go over all of the stuff we've done thus far. I did put the answers for the word problem packet. I put those on Schoology as well, so please look over those. Spend some time with it so you're not so overwhelmed when the actual test comes. Make sure all of this stuff from chapter 1, you have it down pat. You can do all of it because I do teach chapter 2 next week, which is right before the test. So you will have to spend some time with that stuff as well. So take the time, make sure you have chapter 1 down pat. The unit 1 test, or the first test in the course, is actually usually the hardest for people. So I do want you to make sure you study for that. Make sure you know everything in and out. Okay, so the last part I have to do is chapter 1-6, and it's called additional equation solving. But if you look in there, it's very specific to radical equations, 1, and quadratic-like equations. So we're going to go ahead and look at those. So first off, radical equations are equations with square roots. So how do we handle equations with square roots? Um, if you look at a square root equation, it could be either easy or it could be difficult. And I'm going to kind of do the easy version and the medium version with you. And it's kind of like the Algebra 1 version and the Algebra 2 version. And we're not going to go further and do harder ones, although I think I did give you one in your book. But we are going to do the linear type and then the quadratic type, so which is Algebra 1 and 2. So as far as steps for solving these, you want to first isolate the radical. And that means you want to get everything around the square root gone. Okay? The second step is to square both sides. And you'll see that's where the difference comes in as far as the types. 3, then you just solve for x, like normal. And again, it's either going to be an Algebra 1 or an Algebra 2 version. So it will be either working backwards, distribute, combine like terms, or it's going to be the stuff that we just did, factoring, FOILing, the whole 9 yards. Okay, so the last step here, step everybody hates. This one, you have to check for answers. You have to check the answers. And the reason you have to check the answers is because sometimes they do not work. Okay, so they may be extraneous. So, and that's called extraneous. So they might be extraneous solutions. So as far as that, you do have to check. All of the Algebra 1, you don't have to. Algebra 2, you don't have to. You probably had a teacher before that made you check them all. You don't necessarily have to, but for square root equations, you do. Okay, so if I look at this, the Algebra 1 type, or the linear type. Okay, so these will have one answer. All right, so if I look at some of these, the first example I have for you is square root of 2x plus 1 equals 3. And if I look at this, there's nothing around the square root, so I don't have to isolate. However, if you look at the second example I'm going to give you, example B. So if I look at this one, you have a 5 there that's kind of hanging out. It's not under the square root. It's kind of just by itself. So we do have to get rid of that 5 first, but we'll do that when we get there. So since I don't have to isolate on A, the second step is to just square both sides. And when you square square root, it goes away. You just get 2x plus 1. 3 squared is 3 times 3, or 9. And then you just work backwards like an Algebra 1 equation. So we go the whole way down, and we get x equals 4. So what I have to do now is check 4 and make sure that works. So if I do plug 4 into the equation, I end up with 2 times 4 plus 1. I end up with 8 plus 1, and I end up with 9. The square root of 9, is that 3? Yes. Okay, so that does work, and x equals 4 is my answer. Now on letter B, you do have to isolate this equation first. So you do have to subtract 5 first. And that's something, it's a little trick that usually people forget to do, but you do have to isolate first. So now that the square root's by itself, now I can square both sides, and I cross this off, and I end up with 4 minus x equals 25. And subtract 4 from both sides, I get negative x equals, what is that, 21. Divide by negative 1, and I end up with x equals negative 21. Okay, so again, we need to go back up, and we need to check to see if that works. So the square root of 4 minus x plus 5 was the equation. So let's look. Square root of 4 minus negative 21 plus 5. Well, negative 20, negative minus a negative is plus plus. That's the square root of 25 plus 5. So what's the square root of 25? 5. Wait a minute. 5 plus 5 is 10. I needed a negative 5. That does not equal negative 5. So therefore, this is an extraneous solution. There is no other solutions, so this one actually has no solution. Okay, so there can be extraneous solutions when you do these. Unfortunately, you do have to check. Okay, all right, so those would be the linear type or the algebra 1 type. The next type are the algebra 2 type or quadratic type. And remember, when you have a quadratic equation, you are going to see an x squared. You are going to have 2 answers. So that's the idea. Okay, so example A for here, it's going to look a little bit different. And see if you can spot the difference. All right, compare this A with the other A. So if I go back up, if I look over here on the right-hand side, I see just a number, 3. But if I go down here on the right-hand side, you actually see an expression. That is the difference. Okay, that is going to make it an algebra 2 type. So when you square both sides here, yes, the square root's going to go away and you're going to get x minus 3. But the other side is x minus 5 times x minus 5. And you must do FOIL for that. Okay, so if I go down through, x minus 5 times x minus 5 is x squared minus 5x minus 5x. Negative 5 times negative 5 is positive 25. Should be good with foiling after last week before it'll ton with the eyes. Okay, so if I keep simplifying, I end up with a negative 10x plus 25. And you can see there is the x squared. Okay, so what's the rule of thumb for x squared? You've got to get it equal to 0. So I'm going to get rid of the x. I'm going to subtract the x, and I'm going to add a 3. All to the other side, because I do not want anything over there on that side. So I have an x squared. I'm going to now have negative 11x's, and I'm now going to have plus 28. There, with simplifying, FOIL, combining, I have now reached a quadratic equation, and this is the one that we do have to factor. X and x, there's your trinomial. Which factors of 28 add to make 11? And at this point, maybe hopefully you're getting good at these. So 7 times 4 is 28, but 7 plus 4 is 11, and they are both negative. There's your 2 pieces. Set them each equal to 0. And x minus 4 equals 0. Add 7 to both sides, you get x equals 7, and you get x equals 4. There are your 2 answers. Now, after all of this, though, you do have to check those answers. So if I go back to the original equation was the square root of x minus 3 equals x minus 5. So let's try 7 first. So if I plug a 7 in, so I get the square root of 7 minus 3 equals 7 minus 5. Square root of 4 equals 2. The square root of 4 is, in fact, 2. So 7 does work. Now, let's try 4. So if I plug a 4 in here, I get 4 minus 3 equals 4 minus 5. And if I do 4 minus 3, I get 1. And if I do the square root of 1, now keep in mind, you're doing this on a calculator. If you do the square root of 1 on a calculator, you get 1. Does 1 equal negative 1? No. And that means 4 is an extraneous solution. As a matter of fact, you will never get anything negative over here. So when you do a square root on the calculator, it will never produce a negative number. So that is actually not a solution. So the only solution that you do have there is x equals 7. Okay. As far as the algebra 2 type, I am going to go ahead and just do one of those ones. I believe on your test I put the first type, but I think on your quiz you might have the algebra 2 type. So again, that'll give you extra practice at it and make sure you can do that kind. Okay, the next thing in chapter 1.6 is quadratic-like equations. And these are equations that are the same exact thing as factoring, but you are going to have x4s and you are going to have x negative 2s, okay, which is very weird. If I go back and I look at all my quadratic equations, they had x squareds, okay? All those factorings, all those ones we've done, they've all had x squared. Well, this time they are going to have x4s and x negative 2s. Now, the thing is, they are solved exactly the same way. You factor, okay? And like I said, the factoring is important here, all right, because you will do it over and over and over. So let's look at them. Okay, so the first thing I would like to do is 2 basic factoring problems just to kind of review our factoring and make sure we got it. So let's do this one, and let's factor this one. Okay. You know what? We're going to make them both actually the same because I want to make sure they work. Okay. So let's factor that one. Okay. So which factors of 4 subtract to make 3? So not going to be 2 and 2. It's going to be 4 and 1. And how do I have to subtract that to make 3? I have to do negative 4 and I have to do positive 1. Okay. Now compare that with this. It's literally exactly the same. So if I have x to the 4th now, minus 3x squared minus 4. This is exactly the same problem. X and x, factors of 4 that subtract, factors of 4 that subtract to make 3, negative 4, positive 1. The only thing that's different is you now have little 2's on your x's. So if you have an x to the 4th, you do need those x squareds. So if I look at my 2 pieces, I have x squared minus 4 equals 0. And then I have x squared plus 1 equals 0. And if I work backwards, I add 4 to both sides. I get x squared equals 4. And if I square root both sides, you do get x equals plus or minus 2. You do have to remember that there are 2 answers there. That is actually an x squared. Over here, subtract 1 from both sides, you get x squared equals negative 1. And if you square root both sides, you get x equals plus or minus, what the heck is the square root of negative 1? You can't do that, so that is actually I. So the other 2 answers are plus or minus I. So recall, if you did have to do like the square root of negative 25, remember that was 5i. Okay, so since it's 1, it is just 1i. So if you look at this, how many answers do you have? You have 2 answers here, and you have 2 answers here. So you have a total of 4 answers, and that is directly related to that. That power of x does tell you how many answers you have. So when we did all the algebra 1 problems, the linear equations, they had 1 answer. Quadratics, all the x squareds, they have 2 answers. So these x4 ones, they are going to have 4 answers, and each of the pieces are going to have 2. So that is kind of a quadratic-like equation. There is also another kind. you could possibly have negative 2's on your x's. So let's go ahead and compare that. So same problem, but what if I put negative 2's now on my x's? And of course a negative 1 in the middle. Okay, again, guys, it still looks like a trinomial. It still looks like the quadratics. So you still do this exactly the same. Okay, all these weird problems in math, there are so many different kinds, but the cool thing is these are done the same. If you recognize them, they truly are the same. But you got to put something different on your x's this time. This time, you are actually putting negative 1's on your x's. The x's will actually follow the middle term in both cases. So if it's x4, the second one's going to be x2. Both yours will be x2. If it starts out x negative 2, the middle is x to the negative 1. Both of them will be negative 1. So if I go down and set these equal to 0, because there's my two pieces, so I get x to the negative 1 minus 4 equals 0. And then x to the negative 1 plus 1 equals 0. And you end up with x to the negative 1 equals 4, and x to the negative 1 equals negative 1, because I'm going to subtract 1 from both sides, and I'm going to add 4. Okay, now, if you're not too sure about negative 1's, over here, the opposite of x squared was square root, but over here, what is a negative 1? That is actually reciprocal. So if x to the negative 1 equals 4, then x equals 1/4. And that's just, that is a reciprocal. Over here, if I did negative 1 over negative 1, I still end up with negative 1. So regardless, if you flip negative 1, you still end up with negative 1. So that doesn't matter, but it is still negative 1. So there are your two answers. Now this one will only have two answers. So, but if you look at that, that is the two types of quadratic-like equations. So on the left, you will have 4 answers if you have an x to the 4. On the right, you will have 2 answers if you have an x to the negative 2. Okay, those are the two quadratic-like problems that you could possibly have. Again, in your textbook, these get slightly difficult. So I would really focus on these two examples. Again, some resources might be Khan Academy, and you can look up quadratic type equations and look for the ones with the 4's or the negative 2's. So these are the two that you will be responsible for doing. And I do believe I put a 4-1 on your quiz. So please pay extra attention to the x to the 4th. But you are able to have either one of those. And I could take any factoring problem I want and give it to you. So for example, I chose this one up here. I could choose any factoring problem like that, and I can convert it to a 4, or I could convert it to a negative 2. Bottom line is you don't do anything different. The only thing different is the little powers of x's, okay, on the x's. So as far as that, I do feel that chapter 1.6 and 1.5 is the hardest stuff that we do in this course. So I do want to remind you again to please, it's actually kind of good that I'm actually making these videos. So you can go back, you can listen to it, you can do it again, you can listen to it again, you can listen to it before the test even. So it actually is going to always be there for you, which is cool. So that is the idea. I hope you enjoyed listening to me. I hope it was enabled you to stay warm and stay inside at least. And I hope the videos worked. So you'll have to let me know your feedback next class. So I will see you next Thursday, and we will do chapter 2, and we will talk about our first exam. Okay, have a good night. Thanks.